Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. I am Pratik and I'll be taking up the news today discussion for 18th May. So we have 5 main news and we also have certain quick updates along with place in news. So in the first main news, we have the proposal for framework of measuring India's knowledge-based economy and its contribution in GDP. So here we'll understand what exactly is knowledge economy, why it is important, and why do we need to measure it. Second is with respect to factors behind sharp decline of Antarctica's sea ice. There has been some fascinating research. So here we'll look into some of the reasons why there is a huge decline of Antarctica's ice and what exactly is the importance of Antarctica. The third news is demographic transition theory and its implication on India. So here we will discuss in the line of Andhra Pradesh government's providing certain benefits to those who are going for the third and fourth children. Fourth news is Netherlands returns 11th century Chola copper plates to India. So here we will look into what exactly is the nature of these copper plates and why they are important. What exactly do they tell us about the Chola Empire? And in the last news, we will be discussing that India has rejected permanent court of arbitration ruling on the Indus Water Treaty. And in the place in news, we'll be covering Indonesia. So let us start with the very first news, that is a proposed framework for measuring India's knowledge-based economy's contribution to GDP. And this proposal is being released by Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, which wants to assess and identify the contribution and role played by the knowledge economy and its contribution in the overall GDP of the country. So in light of this, we need to understand what exactly is knowledge economy, why it matters, and how do we make sure that we are able to properly quantify its contribution in the Indian economy. So first thing first, what exactly is knowledge economy? So traditionally, the traditional economy is determined on the basis of access of various resources like land, labor, capital, etc. Okay, so these and all the other resources. So these economy is powered by physical resources. For example, economy of say countries like West Asia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, largely they are determined by their export of one single or couple of raw materials. Okay, but the problem is the world is now going towards knowledge economy. Now, what is knowledge economy? Knowledge economy is that kind of economy which is not dependent on the resources per se, but it is determined on your mental capacity. So based on your mind, how do you process the aspects that you have been given with, and what do you do with whatever is given to you? For example, Japan is one of the country which lacks very much with respect to the physical resources, but Japan continues to be one of the highest per capita income country because of its investment in the knowledge economy. While on the other hand, most of the traditional economies, those which are reliant on the resources, they have been subjected to what is known as resource curse or Dutch disease. Why? Because they have been utilizing that product for exporting, thereby they have reduced their economy or the potential of other economy to grow, right? So the idea is that in the present economy, the share of knowledge economy is growing rapidly. But the problem is it is very difficult to measure because it is very easy to identify the number of products that have been created in an industrial process, but it is very difficult to identify the kind of economic output created by knowledge economy. So this is the purpose for which Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has asked for various advice by various people to ensure how to measure the contribution through labor, capital, innovation, and digital sectors. So let us understand it in more detail. So what exactly is knowledge-based economy? It is economic system driven by information. So what kind of information you have, it also drives economy. Okay, information, skills is basically application of information. So for example, you may have writing skill. Writing skill can be converted into advertisement. It can be converted into screenplay. So information, skills, innovation. Innovation means that you are using existing procedure, or you are ensuring that you are improving upon the process, or you are creating a new different product altogether. So innovation and intellectual property. Intellectual property basically means the property that you acquire or you get as a result of application of your mind. For example, literary work, for example, any chip design. So all of these are product of intellect and not entirely product of the resources that you have. So this is what is knowledge economy. Now, knowledge economy can be categorized into two ways. First is codified knowledge, which is easily documented, which is easy to understand that yes, it is a product. For example, the know what and know how. For example, the programs or digital things, which files which are there, codes. So these are what are called as codified knowledge. Then there is tacit knowledge, which cannot be easily codified, but they are more implicit in nature. For example, experience. For example, things like which are very difficult to codify, such as know-how, know-who, etc. So according to World Bank, the knowledge economy relies on four important pillars. First is based on the institution. So as an institution provides, what kind of incentive does it provide? Does it provide incentive to knowledge-based economy, or does it de-incentivize? So incentivization is a very important thing. Second is availability of skilled labor and education. So without proper education, you cannot expect to have a thriving knowledge economy. The third aspect is with respect to strong ICT infrastructure, because the ICT infrastructure allows the knowledge and skill to convert into the products, right? For example, the codified knowledge, etc. Then a vibrant innovation landscape, which brings different kind of players together, such as your academia. Academia will provide cutting edge knowledge. The private sector will also try to optimize what is demanded, right? And then civil society, which will try to bring all these factors together. So basically what World Bank has said is that we require four elements or four framework in order for the knowledge economy to thrive, and these are the incentivization. Second is availability of skilled labor and education. Third one is strong ICT infrastructure, and fourth is academia and private sector and civil society partnership. Now let us also understand what exactly are the specific significance of knowledge-based economy. So as I discussed about the Japan-based example, we have seen that Japan, despite having very limited physical resources, they have been able to develop because of their knowledge economy. So one thing is very clear, that it has huge return, right? Because it doesn't require too much capital. Even if it requires capital, but it doesn't require too much enough physical resources. So it generates increasing returns through innovation spillovers and through repeated use and sustained long-term economic growth. So it has this benefit. The second important benefit is that it leads to transformation of value creation. It creates value out of thin air, right? Because of the application of mind about understanding what the customer want and then designing the product according to the same line, right? So knowledge-based activities are now contributing over 50% of GDP in the major OECD countries or the developed countries. Thirdly, they also create high skill employment. It creates high wage jobs and increased demand for skilled knowledge workers. So according to a Niti Aayog report, India doesn't have a problem or a major problem of unemployment. The problem that India particularly faces is that we do not have enough skill-based employment or good employment, gainful employment. Now this can be created through generation of knowledge economy. Then national innovation systems, they rely on dynamic interlinkages with academia, government and industry, which can be useful for interactive learning and for diffusion of innovation. And lastly, we also have examples such as Digital India by METI, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, TKDL, Ayush, GI Tag, etc., which seek to provide platform for the knowledge workers and tend to amplify our reach for traditional economy. So these are the whole significance of traditional economy, or the knowledge-based economy. Right. So let's talk about the second important news of the day. And this is about a paradox that was earlier very difficult for the researchers to identify. And the paradox was that due to climate change, Arctic sea ice was melting. But the problem was they were not seeing such kind of ice melting in the Antarctica region. But lately, since 2015, Antarctica has also seen a significant decline in its ice, right? And this earlier had perplexed the researchers. But now the researchers have identified a couple of reasons why this might be so. So we'll understand what exactly are the major factors and why Antarctica is important at large. Right? So what is the extent of the decline? Antarctica has lost approximately 12,800 square kilometer of grounded ice between 1996 and 2025. And this topic belongs to GS paper 3, environment. Okay. So what are the factors that have been found? See, this destabilization has happened because of the interplay of three interconnected factors. What are these factors? First is deep ocean heat. The second factor is powerful wind. And the third factor is self-reinforcing feedback loop. So if you look at the ocean surface in the Antarctica, it is not uniform, but it is like this. Okay, so at the surface, it is very cold, or it is cold and icy water is there, right? And here towards the second level, you have the salty water. So salty water is dense, and because it is dense, it subsides below the ocean surface. For a very long time, this surface would have prevented heat to flow from this surface to the ocean bottom, right? But since 2015, this arrangement has changed. So the Southern Ocean was strongly layered. So it was strongly layered with cold fresh water. Cold fresh water would be sitting on top of the warmer, saltier water below. And this arrangement would stop the heat from reaching the surface. And this barrier was weakened by 2015. So till 2015, this barrier was enabling the condition to persist. But after 2015, something happened because of which this arrangement could not persist. So what happened? Because of powerful wind, what the powerful wind did is that it redistributed the heat. Okay, it strengthened because of the ozone hole and because of the greenhouse gas emission. It acted like a pump, and it gradually drawing warm, salty, deep water closer to the surface. So it allowed the salty water to come to the surface, and then there was huge intermixing that was done. So that was the second stage. The third important factor was because this whole mixing process, the powerful, stronger westerly winds, and then what happened was it led to strong reinforcing of feedback loop. The rising deep water brought heat and salt to the surface. And because of that, it created a feedback loop where the heat was redistributed within the layers. Okay. So the heat melts ice below, while the extra salt makes the surface water denser and easier to mix with the warmer waters below. And that allows even more heat to rise upwards. So water was rising upwards and making it harder for new ice to form. And because of that, the ice started to melt, right? So these are the reasons that we should know. Again, we need to just have a basic non-technical understanding of this whole matter. Okay. So these three things you should know. Now let us understand the role and significance of Antarctica. So first is it acts as a climate regulator. It reflects solar radiation and help regulate Earth's climate and temperature because of the presence of the ice. The second important is that it acts as a fresh water reserve. It stores nearly 70% of the world's fresh water in its ice sheets. The third important significance of Antarctica is that it helps in ocean circulation. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is the world's strongest ocean current, forms part of the global ocean conveyor belt connecting the Pacific, Atlantic and Indian Ocean, and supplies water, heat and nutrients along the globe. So it also acts as a conveyor belt in the sense of ocean circulation. Next, it also supports a huge biodiversity, including species like krill, penguins, seals, and whales. And then it also acts as a carbon and heat sink, right? So these Southern Ocean absorbs excess heat and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So these are the significant. Therefore, we must also make sure that we are looking into the developments happening in the Antarctic, because whatever happens at Antarctic doesn't just stay at Antarctic. It can impact the world at large, right? Because of these reasons. Okay. The third topic is demographic transition theory and its implication on India. So why we have used this particular topic is because an application of this principle was recently witnessed in Andhra Pradesh, where the Andhra Pradesh government has recently announced certain financial incentives for third and fourth child, okay, because of certain reason. So the idea is that the India's replacement fertility rate is 2.1, which is on track, right, which is fine, but it is not evenly distributed. At the northern stage or at the northern India, we mostly have a higher fertility rate. But if you go down south, the fertility rate declines to 1.5, which is significant because it can have a potential crisis in the future. And that is why, to induce people to have more and more children, Andhra Pradesh government has provided this incentive. And now this is a very important topic from the perspective of GS1 paper, Indian society, and also with respect to social issues. So let us take a look into what exactly is demographic transition theory, what exactly are the 5 stages of the demographic transition, and how does it impact India, in what ways. So let us take a look into the demographic transition theory. So first is, it talks about, or it explains something. It explains the transition from a high fertility rate and mortality. For example, this is the first stage. Okay, so from stage 1 to stage 5. So the green here represents the birth rate, the number of people who are getting birth, 10,000 in 10,000 people, and then you have the death rate, which is the people who are dying per 10,000 population. Okay, so this rate from this stage, from a high birth rate and high death rate to a stage of low fertility, that is low birth rate and low death rate. Okay, so from this stage to this stage, the transition happens, and this understanding why it happens, its impact, it is known as demographic transition theory. Okay, so it explains how a country's population structure transforms as it develops economically. So with respect to different economic level, different kind of demographic stage is there. Okay, and it was first coined by Warren S. Thompson in 1929 and later on by Frank W. Notenstein in 1945. So let us take a look into the 5 stages of demographic transition. The first stage is high stationary, okay, which means that it is not changing much, but it is stationary. So here at the first stage, both the birth rate is very high and death rates are very high, which means that if, for example, the birth rate is say 70 and the death rate is 60, so per person who are added every year is very significant, is not that much. That is, it is as low as it can be considered as stationary in nature. That is, largely the death and birth are balanced. Okay. Second stage is early expanding with better economic prosperity. Now this stage was largely present in India during the British period, but with some better economic and social conditioning, the stage 2 happens. And in what happens during stage 1, you can see that the birth rate continues to be very high, but the death rates start to fall substantially because of the investment in education, because of the investment in, say, better healthcare facilities, and therefore the decline happens. So this is early expanding. So the net here is that the population start to expand. The third stage is where the birth rate also start to be on the declining side, but the death rate continues to be low because of all the investment done in the healthcare, particularly in terms of eradicating the maternal mortality and the infant mortality. So this is the late expanding stage. Fourth stage is stationary, where you can see that this birth rate has started to decline, but the death rate continues to be low. So this leads to slow population growth, slow and steady. But at the last stage, you can see that the birth rate starts very declining because of very low fertility rates, and the population decline happens because of this. So this stage is also called as demographic winter. Demographic winter. Why demographic? Because it talks about population. Winter essentially in various terms denotes some sort of problem. Okay, so winter here essentially tells you that the population is not at all increasing, and this is basically being seen in countries, especially in the East Asian countries like South Korea. So in South Korea, the total replacement rate is around 0.75 or less than 1. Then also in Japan, South Korea, Japan, etc., we can say that they are facing demographic winter. In fact, we can also say that southern India can also be in that category because they have the TFR less than 1.5. Okay, so as a rule, we can say that those places or regions which has a total fertility rate that is less than 1.5, we can consider them to be part of demographic winter. Okay. Next, what are the implications of demographic transition? Obviously, it has an economic implication, because what happens is when you have population which is largely driven by the senior citizens and it has very less population that can be of working age, then that would lead to interstate divergences, right? Because some of the states in India will have huge young population, but on the other hand, the other states, the southern state, will have older population, right? So states with a high share of young population have a wider window of opportunity, right? So that will create, so there will be more job opportunity created because of the demographic transition. Secondly, it will also change the dependency ratio. By 2050, this data is there, 1 in 5 Indians will be age 60 or above. That is 347 million people, up from 149 million. So this again talks about the potential for silver economy. So as of now, we are talking about demographic dividend because India is among the youngest countries in the world with the median age around 29-30. But this demographic dividend will not continue for a very long time. At some point, India will become aged, right? So we need to have designed products, services, and some of the economics framework designed for the elderly population. And this is precisely known as silver economy. Third is fiscal implication. Because of the aging states may experience shrinking tax base because they will have very few people who will be working. So if they have low people working, their demands will be less. They will be contributing less to the income taxation, etc. That will, and apart from that, they will also lead to a lot of fiscal drag because of rising pension cost and healthcare expenditure and greater fiscal stress due to higher debt and interest burdens. Then there will be also potential political implication, because the delimitation and political representation of the state with higher population will be more, and they will be demanding more and more political space, which can have some sort of political implication. And the parliamentary representation can also be tweaked because of that, and because of that there would be some potential conflict or maybe disagreement between the different parts of the country. So these are the implication of the demographic transition on India. Okay, and perhaps because to dispel this notion, Andhra Pradesh government has taken the decision to provide financial incentive to couples who have third or fourth child. In fact, this initiative is not new. Various developed countries have also been doing that. In fact, the same is being done in Japan, in South Korea as well. Okay. So UPSC also asked you a question on the concept of demographic winter. Is the world moving towards such a situation? Elaborate. So here you have to provide the understanding of demographic winter, which we have discussed. You can talk about some examples, but the more important here thing would be you need to talk about why this situation is coming up in the first place. And perhaps this has to do with the economic structure. This has to do with the fact that more and more awareness are coming up with respect to child rearing, and there is more like dual income households. Because of that, there is problem, right, in terms of fertility crisis is also happening. So again, there are a host of reasons that you can mention, and then you can talk about what would be the implication of that. So we have already discussed the implication, and you can specifically talk about the implication in India. The fourth news is about India-Netherlands relations. So recently, Netherlands has returned 11th century Chola copper plates to India that happened during the Prime Minister's visit to Netherlands. And interestingly, in this particular visit also, we have elevated our ties to strategic partnership, okay, right? So this is a topic which is from GS2IR, and these artifacts have been in the possession of Leiden University of Netherlands and are popularly known as Leiden copper plates. Okay, so here we just need to know a couple of details about the Chola copper plates, what exactly is mentioned here, what exactly are the significance. So first, let's talk about some of the factual aspect. What about the Leiden copper plates? So they contain 21 large and 3 small copper plates, and they are fastened, which means that they have this kind of structure where there is a bronze ring as well, and in this bronze ring it bears the seal of a Chola king, that is King Rajendra Chola I, and another set it carries the seal of Kulotunga Chola I. So it has the seal of 2 important Chola kings. Secondly, the language used in the seals are twofold, they are Sanskrit and Tamil. Thirdly, these plates were brought to Netherlands in 1712 from Nagapattinam by a missionary known as Florentius Camper, right? So he was a Dutch missionary and he was associated with the Dutch East India Company. Then what exactly is the significance of these copper plates? So it provides useful insight into the kind of administration that Chola Empire had. It talks about the taxation process. It talks about the land reforms measure that were undertaken, about the land grants that were made, the irrigation system that were used, and they also talk about the various trade practices that they followed. So it provides a wealth of information about the Chola administration in our country. Now, it also talks about, specifically, now this part is very important, it talks about the grant of Anai Mangalam village to a Buddhist vihara. Okay, so there was a land grant given to a Buddhist vihara. Vihar is the dwelling place of the Buddhist monk by the Srivijaya rulers. So Srivijaya rulers were not based in India, but they were based in Southeast Asia. So in a way, what it signifies is that India during that time had relation with the Southeast Asian countries, right? And importantly, this also signifies religious harmony because the Cholas were predominantly Hindu kings, right? And they did not have any problem with providing lands for the Buddhist monks. So it also indicates that our Look East or Act East policy, the cultural component was embedded from a very early stage, okay? So this part is very significant because it shows that our ties with Southeast Asia is cultural and has deep historical background, okay? Plus, if you look at some of the copper plate inscription that we have in India, inspired from this, right, topic, that first the official records engraved on the copper sheets are usually tied together with a ring bearing the royal seal. So this is how generally what happens with copper plates are, that there is a ring that talks about the royal seal. It talks about for what purpose this has been issued. And they are usually recorded grants of land. So if somebody is given grant of the land, so now we have deeds paper or digital record of the deeds, okay? But earlier it was done through an official seal and copper plate was generally used during that time. It talks about the list of the loyal lineages, right? So it talks about who is going to be part of the succession. It talks about grants made under religious tenure. It talks about donations, right? So it talks about, it is essentially like a documentation purpose, but with official seal. Okay, so earliest known copper plate inscription. Now this is very important from prelims perspective. Sogura copper plate of Mauryan era. So this is the earliest known copper plate, mentioning the hunger relief effort, and it has Prakrit language and Brahmi script. Then, so this indicates that India was a welfare state in the modern age as well, because we provided for famine relief as well, hunger relief as well. And majority of the copper plate inscriptions are concentrated in the southern state. Now you tell me what exactly could be the reason for this. Fine. And let's talk about some information about the imperial Cholas, which were from 850 AD to 1279 AD. Now they are referred to as Muvendhar in the Sangam literature. Now Sangam literature was a frequent area from where UPSC has asked question about what kind of information does it provide in terms of the life, society, economy of the South India. It was a major Tamil dynasty along with Cheras and Pandyas. Now major rulers of the Cholas include Vijayala, who is the founder, and Parantaka Chola, Rajaraja Chola I, who conquered northern Sri Lanka and Maldives, Rajaraja Chola, and then Rajendra Chola I, who conquered the Sri Vijaya kingdom. Now the copper plates that were found were of Rajendra Chola I, and he founded Gangai Konda Cholapuram. Okay. Cultural patronage, so they also patronized the cultural aspects as well, not just they were focused on warfare or in administration, but they also inspired people to go for cultural contribution. In fact, flourishing of Tamil literature and composition of works such as epic poem Kalinga Puttaparani and devotion hymns, Thevarams by Nayanars were also promoted during this time. Architecture, Brihadeshwar temple in Thanjavur, Airateshwara temple in Dasashuram, and the Gangai Konda Cholapuram temples are the important architectural marvels during the Chola period. And the metal structure includes solid metal sculptures made through lost was method using alloy of the 5 metals: copper, silver, gold, tin, and lead. So this will give you a very brief contribution that the Cholas empire had in terms of their overall contribution, right? So it talks about their economic contribution, their contribution to the society, contribution to the architecture, all these things. Fine. The fifth news is about the development on Indus Water Treaty, and India recently has rejected a permanent court of arbitration ruling on the Indus Water Treaty, right? So what India has given the argument is India has never recognized the establishment of the COA, that is Court of Arbitration, under which the matter was referred by Pakistan. Okay, and India has kept, the present position of India is that India has kept the treaty in abeyance. Abeyance means that the treaty is on temporary hold. Now this happened because earlier PM Modi mentioned that blood and water will not flow together, and because of the terrorist activities that continue to go from or that come from Pakistan, we had now decided that we will take a relook of the entire Indus Water Treaty. So now let's take a brief look into what exactly is the nature of the treaty and what exactly is the dispute resolution mechanism. What are the 3-step dispute resolution process that IWT provides for? So here, Indus Water Treaty was signed in 1960 between India and Pakistan, and it was mediated by the World Bank. It was basically to determine how the water of Indus would be divided between the two countries. Now, India was the upper riparian and Pakistan was the lower riparian. So as per Brahma Chelani, Indus Water Treaty is one of the most generous treaty that an upper riparian has entered with the lower riparian country, right? And what exactly is the nature of this treaty? That it provides for all the main rivers of the Indus basin, that is Satluj, Beas river, and Ravi, that is the eastern rivers, and the Jhelum, Chenab, and Indus, that are the western rivers. So with respect to the distribution, India has exclusive right or exclusive access for the eastern river, that is Satluj, Beas and Ravi. And Pakistan has largely access for the western rivers. But at the same time, India has been given the right for non-consumptive usage of the western rivers. And what is the meaning of non-consumptive usage? It means that India can use this for run of the river electricity projects and for the domestic purposes, which doesn't require substantial storing of the river. And if there is any sort of dispute, legal or administrative, it has to be resolved or decided by a three-step process. So first step is there is Permanent Indus Commission, that is PIC. Now PIC has members from both countries. They generally used to meet annually, alternatively in both countries, and they would monitor and try to resolve any dispute on a bilateral level. Now, if this matter could not, if a matter is there which cannot be resolved by the Permanent Indus Commission, then it would go to step number 2. And here, there will be a neutral expert. Neutral expert means that it will not be from India or Pakistan. It will be appointed by World Bank, because World Bank is the signatory of this treaty. And it will help in involving rendering a binding decision. And the third step is the arbitration step. That is the court of arbitration upon agreement between the parties. Now, this is very important because the third step can only happen when the first two stages have not been successful, right? And it can be done at the request of either party, right? So what India says is that Pakistan has directly jumped to step number 3 without going with the step number 2, okay? And especially because Pakistan has contested that India's design in Kishanganga and Ratle hydroelectric projects violate the terms of Indus Water Treaty. India contests both the claims. India says that neither there is any merit in the substance of what Pakistan is saying. And the second thing is that Pakistan has taken this matter to COA, which again is a violation of the provisions of the Indus Water Treaty itself. That is why India does not recognize the COA, right? So COA is a 5-member arbitral panel constituted in 2023 at the Pakistan's request, and India has refused to participate, saying that the dispute fall within the remit of the neutral expert. So this part, step 2, appointed by the World Bank. That is why India has continued to mention that Indus Water Treaty for India's perspective is under abeyance, that is under temporary stay, and India wants to have a complete renegotiation of the treaty because of several changes that have happened due to climate change, due to human settlement, and also because the treaty was largely seen as a peace gesture by India, so that Pakistan can and India can have better bilateral relation. But since the terms or the intentions have been changing, therefore India wants to go for a complete renegotiation of the treaty. So this is the present position as of now. So this is the place in news. Let's talk about the place in news. And the place in news that we are going to discuss today is Indonesia. And why it was in news? Because a volcano erupted in Indonesia's North Maluku province. So what was the name of the volcano? It was Dukono volcano. Okay, so this volcano erupted. So let us just take a quick look into the various political and geographical features of Indonesia. So first, it is located between Indian and Pacific Ocean, and it is off the mainland of Southeast Asia. Okay, so it is part of the Southeast Asia. And what are the major islands? So major islands are Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Papua. The boundaries that it shares, land boundaries with East Timor, which is the latest member that has joined ASEAN. So ASEAN now has 11th member as East Timor, right? Papua New Guinea and Malaysia. Now, as per the, it was also a founding member of the NAM movement as well, where Suharto was very important, right? Along with India. With respect to the geographical features, it is located at the convergence of the tectonic plates. It is part of the Ring of Fire, making it highly disaster prone, which explains why so many earthquakes and volcanic eruptions happen here. Secondly, it has presence of 100 plus active volcanoes such as Mount Merapi, Mount Krakota. And the climate is obviously very tropical because of its location along the equator. Now let's move on to the next segment, that is quick updates. In the first news, we are going to cover jaggery or good. Now we have seen that the world level or at the world over, there is a huge movement for health and fitness, and sugar is now considered to be one of the major issues or major enemy of fitness, right? Therefore, a substitute for sugar is jaggery is looked as a substitute for sugar, and that is why it becomes very important. And the good thing is that India accounts for over 70% of the global jaggery production, and this makes it the world's largest jaggery producer. So what about jaggery? What exactly it is? It is known as a superfood, a natural nutrient-rich alternative to refined sugar. So as I discussed earlier, there's a global movement against consumption of refined sugar because it leads to empty calories, it leads to weight gain, it leads to diabetes and several other diseases. Therefore, people are now going for stevia or different kind of other supplements. But good or jaggery is a natural product. That is why it becomes even more significant. So jaggery is produced from concentrated sugarcane juice without any chemical refining. Okay. It therefore retains all the essential minerals and micronutrients. So what kind of minerals does it have? It has calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, sodium, iron, zinc, copper, and manganese. You name it, everything is here. What are the benefits? It provides quick energy. It aids in treating anemia, which is lack of iron. Strengthens immunity, so it has immunity boosting power as well. It treats throat and lung infections, supports digestion. Now, in terms of production, Uttar Pradesh contributes almost 48.5% production, followed by Maharashtra, which is around 24.41%, and Karnataka, that is 10.5%. So, UP, Maharashtra, and Karnataka are the three most largest jaggery producing states in India. Next news is Ebola. Now, Ebola has again come into news because recently the World Health Organization has declared Ebola outbreaks in Congo and Uganda as a public health emergency of international concern. Okay, so it has not yet to be declared a pandemic, but it has been declared as a public health emergency, which means that it merits some important consideration. We need to understand what exactly is Ebola, right? So what is Ebola virus? It is a rare but severe illness in human, and it transmitted, like it has a zoonotic transmission. Zoonotic basically means that it has its origin in animals. So it is transmitted to people from wild animal such as fruit bats, porcupines, and non-human primates, and then spreads in the human population. The transmission medium is contact with the blood, secretions, organs, or other body fluids of the infected person. So it's a highly infectious disease as well. Next is silver. So earlier government has put curbs on gold. Now government has also put curbs on import of silver, and it has put silver under the restricted category, which means that importing of silver has become difficult, and it has imposed a 15% import duty, and the idea is to curb the rising demand of silver. Okay, so let us talk about some of the important details of silver. So it is a relatively soft and shiny metal. So it is a metal. What are the applications of silver? Apart from it being a store of value, it is also has highest electrical and thermal conductivity. So it is very important component of electronics, right? So integrated circuits, etc. They use silver. It is also used for circuit boards, connectors, batteries, and automotive system. Then it has natural abundance where silver occurs in ores such as argentine and chlorogyrite, that is horn silver. And the leading producer of silver is Mexico. Next topic is Saranda forest. So why this is a news? So Saranda basically means land of 700 hills, and it is located in Jharkhand. It was in news because Supreme Court has directed Jharkhand excuse me, to notify the Saranda forest as wildlife sanctuary amid concerns over mining, elephant habitats, and conservation of sal forest landscape. Right, so this is why it is in news. So Saranda forest is the largest sal forest in Asia. It is located in Jharkhand. Sal tree is a moist deciduous tree. Saranda means the land of 700 hills. What kind of fauna it has? It has endangered species of flying lizards and elephants. Flora includes sal, kusum, mushroom, mahua, etc. And nearly 80% of the human population in this region belongs to tribes such as Ho, Munda, Orao, or some primitive tribes. So both from the perspective of preservation of the flora, fauna, and the tribal population, this decision has been taken by the Supreme Court to notify this as a wildlife sanctuary. Therefore, so that its resources should not be mined, right? It should be sustainably utilized and it should be conserved properly. Next is about Amur falcons. So Union Minister has highlighted the return migration of the satellite tagged Amur falcon, and it showcased our successful community-led conservation efforts in Manipur. Right, so they have successfully returned in Manipur, and it is very important because it signifies that how important role does community plays in terms of conservation of important species. So what are the characteristics of this Amur falcons? It is locally known as Kahuai puinia in Manipur, and it is a migratory raptor. It makes voyage from breeding grounds in Russia and China to southern Africa via India. So basically it goes for a 22,000 kilometer journey and longest sea crossing of any raptor. It passes through Manipur and Nagaland. It feeds on dragonflies that follow a similar migration path over the Arabian Sea. With respect to the conservation status, under IUCN they are of least concern, and under Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 they have been given Schedule 1. Next is India-Sweden relation. So recently PM Modi is on a trip of the Nordic countries, and India had secured the returning of copper plates from Netherlands, as we have just seen. Now we have also gone and had elevated our ties with Sweden as strategic partnership. Now what exactly are the core pillars of the strategic partnership with respect to Sweden? So first is it is going to have strategic dialogue for stability and security. In the light of the volatility that we are seeing across the world, and especially in Europe and Middle East, this becomes very important. Second is, from this strategic dialogue for some security, it also goes to economic partnership, next generation economic partnership. So we are already talking about the knowledge economy part. So this next generation economic partnership will also going to give a boost to that. Thirdly, emerging technologies and trusted connectivities. Fourth, shaping tomorrow together, people, planet, health, and resilience. So it is a very wide-ranging cooperation that has taken place, and it includes security, it includes economy, it includes technology, it also includes people-to-people ties and sharing of supply chain as well. Then what exactly are the key outcomes of the meet? Both countries had adopted a joint action plan for 2026-2030, and it has elevated bilateral ties to strategic partnership. Along with that, we also have just done a strategic partnership with Denmark. Sorry, not with Netherlands. It has set ambitious goal of doubling bilateral trade and investment target in 5 years, and launched a joint innovation partnership 2.0 and India-Sweden technology and AI corridor. So these are the major outcomes of the meeting. So this is where Sweden is. So it is sandwiched between Norway and Finland, and below this there is Denmark. So Denmark is the administrative controller of Greenland. Okay, and here you have the Baltic Sea and the Baltic countries. This is Russia, right? So make sure that you also look into the map of this before you go and read anything further. Next is about RDI fund scheme, that is Research Development and Innovation Fund and scheme, and this the first electronic fund disbursement was released. So we just need to know a couple of things about RDI fund. So first, it is under Department of Science and Technology, under the Ministry of Science and Technology. What is the corpus of this fund? It is around rupees 1 lakh crore. And what is the aim? Aim is to ensure that India's largest investment in research-led innovation, it aims to catalyze the private investment in R&D, breakthrough and critical technologies, innovation, etc. So again, as we had discussed earlier about how knowledge economy is so important, and knowledge economy, in order to foster, it requires innovation, and innovation can only happen when state or the institution provides some incentive. So this we can consider to be one of the incentive that could promote the knowledge economy. Captagon. Now this is again a very interesting news, because the Narcotics Control Bureau has, under the Operation Rage Pill, unearthed the first ever international drug syndicate involved in the trafficking of Captagon, which is also known as jihadi pill. Okay, so what exactly is Captagon? We need to know this. So Captagon, it basically contains fentanyl used to treat conditions such as ADHD, depression, and narcolepsy, and amphetamine, which are psychotropic substances. So these basically, Captagon has these two major ingredients, and they are banned under the Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985. So NDPS Act is enacted to prohibit and regulate the production, possession, trafficking and consumption of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Now interestingly, it is known as jihadi drug because it is used by the militant groups like ISIS, and particularly they are used to numb your senses, and if you consume this, you will be able to have this kind of high that you will be able to be productive for a very long time, and you will be feeling a lot of euphoria as well. So in a way, this will help you do a lot of tasks, but it has a huge consequences, negative consequences in the long term. That is why it has been kept under, or it has been banned under the NDPS Act of 1985. So not just in India, but it has been banned internationally in the 1980s after the concerns over addiction and abuse, and was later placed under Schedule 2 of the UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. So this is a major development. We need to know a couple of small facts about this information. Right? So this is all about news today. I hope this was useful. Make sure that you also attempt the questions that are popping up on your screen. And with this, all the best. Thank you.